Today, we are going to be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, we've been looking at the presidency of John F. Kennedy after he was elected in 1960. And probably the biggest event that happened during the Kennedy presidency is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, what I'm going to do, there are three parts to this. If you look at the assignment for today, you need to go through this introduction to give you a background on what's happening with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then I'll go through the next couple parts. You're going to analyze some of the recommendations given to President Kennedy about how he should deal with this crisis, and then you're going to look at what actually happened and how he resolved it. So the first thing I'm going to do here is give you this briefing. So the Central Intelligence Agency would have given President Kennedy an overview of all of the evidence that they collected dealing with nuclear missiles in Cuba. So I am going to give you that background information, and you essentially are going to imagine you are President Kennedy, and you are going to look at all of the advice of his committee members, his advisors, and make a decision about what you think is the best way to handle this current situation. So as I mentioned to you a couple of lessons ago, what the United States discovers is that there are medium-range ballistic missiles that have been placed in Cuba by the Soviet Union. So on this map, you can see everywhere where there is a red dot, those are places that they have identified as kind of accumulation of weaponry in those different spots in Cuba. Now, this is our photograph evidence. So we flew spy planes over Cuba, and what you can see is there is a convoy in the middle there of trailers and trucks that are bringing, and then you've got various equipment sites, missile trailers, tents where they're setting up to build these ballistic missiles. So what we know is that the missiles are not yet operational, but they are currently building them. So they've gotten all of the equipment and they are slowly putting them together. So to put together a medium-range ballistic missile is labor-intensive. It requires a lot of work, and we can see that they are building these sites throughout Cuba. We get even closer to them through our U-2 spy planes to confirm that this is what's happening. You can see that there's launcher equipment, which means that's the equipment they would use to launch a missile. There are trailers that are housing the missiles. You've got construction sites set up. So by October of 1962, we are certain that these sites are getting built. There is no question that there are offensive weapons being built in Cuba, and we are also certain that these weapons have come from the Soviet Union. This is then our low-level photograph, and again, it is confirming all of this information. This is a launch site. You've got missile erectors, you've got shelter tents where they would house the missiles, you've got all this kind of assembly of equipment. So again, the evidence is pretty clear. There is no question in the minds of the United States government that ballistic missiles, nuclear ballistic missiles, are being placed in Cuba. Now, I showed you this map earlier. This is the range of a medium-range ballistic missile, an MRBM. If it was launched from Cuba, it would reach that second circle. So you can see there's 3 circles there total. Included in that second circle would be just the outskirts of Washington, D.C., New Orleans, Atlanta, San Antonio, Texas. Okay, a big chunk of southeastern Florida, or Florida, southeastern United States, would be in range of a missile from if it was launched from Cuba. So this is a huge threat to the United States, and a huge concern then that nuclear missiles are so close to our border. You know, it's one thing for the Soviet Union to have nuclear missiles. Those missiles can't reach the United States. But now if they're placed in Cuba, these can absolutely reach the United States and a significant portion of the United States. This is what a medium-range ballistic missile looks like. You can see how big it is compared to the people. So the Soviet Union had a parade of all of their nuclear missiles in the 1950s, and this shows you an example of the type of missile that's being placed. So you can see why you would need a large amount of equipment to launch this missile into the air, which is what the Cubans were building. Now, At the request of the president, we have formed a committee to figure out the best way to respond to this new threat from the Soviet Union and their Cuban allies. And we call this committee XCOM. So, XCOM is made up of a wide range of individuals, people that President Kennedy trusts and that are experienced in dealing with foreign policy. And these XCOM members have come up with a variety of options. And you, as president, you imagining you are President Kennedy, need to make a decision about how you think the United States should handle this crisis. So here are your 5 options. The first option is that you could do nothing. You could just allow the Soviet Union to supply missiles and allow Cuba to build them, and they could just be there. The second option is that you could open up diplomatic discussions with Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba, and Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, and try to negotiate the removal of the missiles. So this would, if you did option number 2, you would say, we are just going to try to talk it out. How can we try to convince you to remove those missiles without the use of any military threat whatsoever? Option number 3 is a naval blockade. What that means essentially is the United States would place U.S. warships all around Cuba, circling the entire island, so that nothing could get in and nothing could get out. And that means not only would they be cut off from military equipment, which would allow them to continue building these missile sites, they would be cut off from all resources from the outside world until they agreed to remove the nuclear missiles. So it is not using military force, but it's using our military to physically block anyone from getting in or out of Cuba. Option number 4 would be to give the Soviet Union and the Cubans a 24-hour warning. We want you to remove these missiles within the next 24 hours, and if you do not remove them, we will launch an airstrike to physically remove those missiles ourselves. We would essentially bomb those missile sites that we have identified to guarantee that the missiles have been removed. So this is warn them first, say, hey, we're going to attack if you don't remove the missiles, and if they don't, then launch an airstrike. And option number 5 is to do a surprise airstrike. So don't give them any warning. Don't give them an opportunity to hide them or give them any wiggle room. Just surprise attack, and then eventually that could potentially lead to an invasion of the Cuban island if we think there's still missiles in place. Okay, now, just to be clear, so you know, options 3, 4, and 5 are all acts of war. Okay, so if we do option 1 or 2, we are not engaging in any war tactics. But if we do options 3, 4, or 5, those are all things that the Soviet Union and Cuba could interpret as an act of war. Okay, we need to consider the consequences of an act of war and what that would mean in the long term, not just the short term. Okay, how important is it for us to remove these missiles? Is it important enough for us to engage in a war? Okay, so listening to this introduction is your part 1. What you need to do for part 2 is to go into the assignment for today, the Cuban Missile Crisis Worksheet, and the front page will look like this. This is from the CIA, and they are showing you, Dear Mr. President, October 16, 1962, recent aerial surveillance of Cuba has spotted several medium-range nuclear missiles, and you can see where those missile sites are, the leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro, the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. And as it says underneath the pictures, as a reminder, Cuba is only approximately 90 miles off the coast of Florida. They could reach approximately 50% of the United States and cause extreme casualties. So we need to act quickly. And once again, your 5 options are listed. Do nothing, do negotiations, order a naval blockade, give them a warning first, and then an airstrike, or do an airstrike with no warning. So on page 2 of your assignment, you are going to go through the reading that's called XCOM recommendations, and you are going to look at the advisors to President Kennedy and see what they think is a good option and what is not a good option. So each of them are going to say, this is what I think we should do, and they're also going to say, this is what I think we should not do. So I have identified them on this paper. For example, Robert Kennedy is going to speak out against doing nothing. So you are going to summarize Robert Kennedy's reasons for why we should do nothing. If you look at number 3, the blockade, Dean Rusk, McNamara, and Robert Kennedy are all going to say that they think the United States should do a blockade, and they're going to give reasons why. You're going to summarize the reasons why they think we should do a blockade. And Taylor, Bundy, and McCone are all going to be opposed to a blockade. And so you're going to look at the reasons and summarize their reasons for why they're against a blockade. So I've identified both in the reading and here on the assignment who's saying what, and you just need to go in and summarize their reasons why they're either in favor or against those options. And then you need to then tell me what you would recommend and what option you think is the worst. Okay, so tell me why, if you had to pick, which of those options, 1 through 5, would you pick based on these XCOM recommendations, and which one sounds like the worst choice for the United States to do? Okay, that's part 2. Then you will go into part 3, which is looking at the textbook, a reading from the textbook that explains what actually happened. Okay, so you're going to answer what option did President Kennedy actually use in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and what was the result? How did the Soviet Union and how did Cuba respond to the choice that President Kennedy made? Okay, that is a very short, make sure you're following just those pages, 532 to 533. And just read the short. There's only a couple of paragraphs that will give you a summary of what happened in the end. Okay, so I know there's kind of multiple parts here, but I tried to make it as clear-cut as possible for you to identify each of the different reasons why we should or shouldn't do each option, and then what actually happened and how this was resolved. Okay, as always, let me know if you have any questions, and I will certainly help. And you can reach out to me either through text message or calling or emailing me. And I can always, if you're stuck on something, I can always give you a phone call back, or I can describe it in more detail through an email. So please don't hesitate to ask me if you have questions. Talk to you soon.